morning, everybody. It is great to be with you all. My name is Brian McLaren. We're together for about 40 minutes, and I'm going to try to talk for less than 30 and make sure we have plenty of time for some discussion. This is my first time at Science and Non-Duality. I've had participated in 3 sessions or listened in on 3 sessions so far. I've had a great day so far. I hope you have too. But I noticed that in all the sessions, people are coming and going and that sort of thing. So if you want to go, I won't be offended. That's just fine. And if you want to stay, I'm really happy for you to stay. Just a bit about myself. I was a college English teacher for a number of years, and then I became a pastor in an interdenominational Christian congregation outside of Washington, D.C. for 24 years. During that time, I started rethinking a lot of things. I started doing some writing. I left the pastorate in 2006, so that makes it 8.5 years ago. And I've just been kind of a writer and going around talking to people and trying to stir up trouble and see what we can do. So I'm going to assume that we have people from all different backgrounds in a session like this. And I'm also going to assume that I can just jump in. I'd like to talk about the world's biggest religion, the world's biggest problems, and some images of non-duality. I don't know if you can interpret this photograph. It's from 1998, Honduras, Hurricane Mitch, which formed in the Caribbean, moved westward across the Caribbean, came just off the coast of Central America and did the worst possible thing. It stopped and just wobbled around for about 7 days. And in so doing, it kept sucking up all that warm, moist Caribbean air and transporting it to the mountains of Central America. And the result was, this is hard to believe, but 100 inches of rain fell in 5 days. The result was catastrophic flooding. They called it a 1 in 10,000 year storm. If you've ever been to Tegucigalpa, the capital, not many people go these days because it's called the murder capital of the world, but a wonderful place with wonderful people. But the capital city is in a ravine, really, and you could just imagine 100 inches of rain created flooding of unimaginable proportions. And the result was that there was a road on the Pacific side of the country, and this is the Choluteca River, which comes down from the mountains to the Pacific. And do you see that bridge there? So that's the bridge that I just showed you a picture of. But when the floodwaters receded, the road you can faintly see coming across, the road had been washed away on both sides of the bridge. The bridge survived, leaving a structure formerly known as a bridge because it doesn't connect anything. And the riverbed ended up in a new place. And I just think that is a wonderful metaphor of things that happen in our world. I mean, rivers are always moving, right? Grain by grain of sand. There's incremental change that we call erosion. But then every 10,000 years, a storm comes along that changes the maps and puts us in a new world, and often renders old structures that are incredibly well built to withstand the storm. It renders them something like a tourist attraction, which is what this bridge became. People from both, they'd come to the end of the road where it ended, and they'd sort of wave across the chasm at the friends they used to visit in the next town. And I think something similar is happening in all of our institutions of society. Huge convergence of changes that's bringing great trauma. But especially to the Christian faith, which is my background. And if you want to think of it this way, the Christian religion makes up about 33% of the world's population, very loosely speaking, would identify with the Christian religion. About 24% with Islam, about 17% with Hinduism. And the fastest growing religious segment in the world is the non-religious, which make up about 17%, probably growing faster than Hinduism. So probably in the next few years, the world's third largest religious grouping will be non-religious, which is quite unique. And so the Christian religion has the most people, the most money, the most weapons, and in that way you could say is the most dangerous one of the most dangerous forces in the world when you put money and weapons together, or maybe one with a lot of potential for good. And so one of the reasons I think, whether you're a Christian yourself or not, it's worthwhile to care about what happens in the Christian religion is because, well, let's put it this way. If 33% of the world's population and 24% of the world's population are at each other's throats, nobody in the world is safe. Can we say it that way? What is the old Buddhist saying? If two elephants fight in the forest, the grass suffers the most. And and I, grew up in a very strict and conservative, you might even say fundamentalist form of the Christian religion. And I felt that there was a kind of a treasure, but I also felt there was a lot of distraction and some problems. Or to use a metaphor that Mirabai Starr, who's here, uses, there were beautiful flowers in the garden, but there were some weeds and that maybe were even poisonous in the garden as well. And some years ago, I really grappled with this in a book I wrote called Everything Must Change. And the genesis for that book had really started back when I was in my 20s. I was a youth worker, and I was working at a summer camp in Pennsylvania. We were in a barn, and there was about 125, 150 teenagers there. And it was my day to speak. And in my tradition, we have a spiritual term for being completely unprepared. We call it being led by the Spirit. So I was pretty unprepared, and it wasn't because I was lazy. It was because I had a lot of responsibilities. I was very busy. And I had an idea of how to start my talk for this day. I had to give the talk for all the kids. I had an idea how to start it. It was like I knew how to get off the runway, but I had no idea my destination or how to land. So I was kind of hoping that inspiration would come in the course of this. So I started by saying to the high school and college students who were there, I said, what do you think, when you were with your friends at school, what are the really important subjects you talk about? And somebody raised their hand. This is the 1970s. She said, communism. Remember that? So I had a whiteboard, and I wrote communism. And somebody else said, I think about overpopulation. My friends and I talk about overpopulation. So I wrote overpopulation. Somebody else said racism. Somebody else said, back then we talked about something called nuclear winter. Somebody said nuclear winter, extinction of species, nuclear war. So we filled up the page, the board, with things that they are concerned about. Now, these were church kids. It was a church camp. And so then I said, let me ask you a question. At your church, what are the issues that people are talking about? And so there's a moment of silence, and then a young guy said, well, at my church, we're having a big argument about creation versus evolution. So I drew a line, and on the other side, I wrote, creation versus evolution. Somebody else said, women clergy. So I wrote women clergy. Somebody else I still remember said, wearing jeans in church. I thought, there's a monumental theological issue. And somebody else said, guitars in church. And somebody else said, drums in church. And so we filled the page up. Back then, nobody was arguing about gay marriage or, gay clergy. They weren't to that point yet. But we filled up the page with the 1970s theological controversies. And so basically, that was the end of my preparation. And I was waiting for some inspiration to come, and I just looked at the two lists, and saw the contrast between them, and I was kind of trying to figure out what to say next. And the students, start looking at the list, and I think they thought I was giving them a dramatic pause, right, when I really had no idea what I was going to say. But it was one of those happy moments where, like, well, not exactly happy, but a kind of shiver went up my spine, and a whole lot of people in the room. Because just by putting those two lists up, you realize, first of all, that the list had absolutely nothing in common. And then here's the thought that sort of went up my spine. Oh my gosh, I think I'm playing for the wrong team. Because if I do a good job of helping these kids be committed to the church and the Christian faith, then when they grow up, they're going to spend all of their energy on that other list. When this list is really, really important. So I don't know what I did. Somehow I finished the talk, and we went somewhere, and one of the other counselors came up to me and said, that was a really great talk. And I said, well, lots of preparation. And, but he said, when you put that list up there, I kept thinking, how would you prioritize that? Like, which of those global issues is the most important? And I remember saying, I hope someday I have time to think about that. Well, some years later, I became a pastor. And guess what? All of my energy was taken up with the wrong list. I mean, no matter how I tried to come back to the big picture list, it was that other religious list that just kept sucking my attention because of the controversy and stress and so on. And so when I left the pastorate, it was a lot of years later, when I left the pastorate, that question that had been on the back burner of my mind came back. And I wanted to answer two questions when I was working on this book, Everything Must Change. First, what are the top global problems? Like, how would you actually figure out what should be at the top of that list if you put them in order? And what does the basic Christian message, and I was especially interested in the message of Jesus, what does that have to say to those top global problems? And because I kind of realized that the Christian community, and I think the same is true in the Muslim and the Hindu and the Buddhist community, we kind of have a fork in the road. Is organized religion, if it's going to continue to exist, is it going to be religion organizing for institutional maintenance, or is it going to be religion organizing for the common good, which will require it to mobilize people to address these critical issues? So I had this wonderful opportunity, having just left the pastorate, to really spend a lot of time in research. And I found out that there was surprisingly little literature on global crises. I mean, that's, you might sound, it's very depressing to study global crises, but you think somebody ought to be studying it. But what you realize is that doctors focus on the critical medical problems, and agronomists focus on the critical soil problems. And you would think, well, maybe politicians should be trying to sort them all out, but they're only thinking about getting reelected. So you realize we have this huge gap of people who are really trying to understand global problems. I found out that there was something called the United Nations University. I never even heard of that before, but it's kind of like the Library of Congress for the United Nations. And they have identified 15 global challenges. And every year they issue something called the State of the Planet Report, or the State of the World Report, which is how are we doing in relation to these 15 global challenges. And I think it's a phenomenal list. Issues like sustainable development, clean water, population growth, democracy, gap between rich and poor, diseases, terrorism, counterterrorism, status of women, organized crime, energy, ethical considerations. A really great list. You probably have heard of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which basically 2015 was the finish line for those. And unfortunately, the global economic meltdown in 2007, right when we reached the critical period of engaging with these 8 Millennium Development Goals, almost everybody's attention got distracted. But you'll probably hear the 8 Millennium Development Goals be talked about again in the next year, and you're going to find out that we made remarkable progress on some of these. Just by identifying some of these, we've made remarkable progress, and some not so much. There was a group of economists called the Copenhagen Consensus, and they came up with a list. And even Rick Warren, the evangelical preacher, a lot of people don't know that after he wrote The Purpose-Driven Life, which sold more books than in the history of publishing, he devoted himself to global crises. And he came up with a pretty good list of global problems that he felt we needed to concentrate on. By the way, he found it was way easier to sell books about having a purpose than actually mobilizing people for the purpose of addressing these problems. That's another story. So what I had the luxury of doing is reading books and meeting with economists and talking with all these people. And I filled up all these yellow pads with my lists of these global crises. And I tried to say which one is a symptom, which is a disease, which is an effect, which is a cause. And I came up with 4 critical problems that I was convinced are the critical issues we face. And it's now, 7 years later, and I'm basically more sure than I was then that these are 4 very serious problems. And I'm going to explain them very briefly. And I think I can explain them in about 8 minutes. And if I succeed, I just want to tell you I've messed up your life. Because every time you look at the newspaper, you're going to see these 4 crises. And every time you hear a political speech, you're not going to see these 4 crises. You see what I'm saying? And every time you go to church and hear a sermon, if you do that, you probably won't hear these 4 crises. So it kind of messes you up when you pay attention to this. But the way I ended up articulating these was to talk about human society, the stuff we've created, as a machine, because a machine is a tool that's fashioned to achieve desire. And the first desire, I think, our societal machinery tries to achieve is prosperity, everything that makes us survive and thrive. And then as soon as you have some stuff that helps you survive and thrive, other people might want to take it, or rust, rot, tidal waves, earthquakes might damage it. So then you develop security systems to protect your prosperity. But then you have to pay for your prosperity and your security, and that involves taxes and government and things like that, courts. And so then you need an equity system to keep the prosperity and security systems operating. Now, I know I said that very fast, but I'll just tell you, I haven't been able to think of anything that human beings do that's not part of that basic matrix of prosperity, security, and equity. And of course, one small detail, that human system takes place within an ecosystem. And I think one of the reasons why a conference like Science and Non-Duality is so important is because it's getting people to think that there's larger realities that all the things we tend to be obsessed with exist in. And you maybe never thought of it this way before, but only one thing comes into the ecosystem of the atmosphere of the Earth every day. That's basically solar energy. I know a meteorite falls in every once in a while, but solar energy comes in every day. Heat goes out every night. Everything else that happens inside this little goldfish bowl, basically. And we human beings suck resources out of the ecosystem, do stuff with it, and then pump wastes back into it. And that brings us to the first crisis. If the human machinery inside the ecosystem is very small, then we have huge stores of resources and huge sinks for our wastes. But if the human footprint becomes too large, we then always can run out of resources or toxify our environment with our wastes. And when that happens, you've got the first crisis. In a sense, you could say it like this: our prosperity system has worked so well that now there are so many of us that make such demands on the planet that we've reached a point of unsustainability. I'm going to guess for all of you that's nothing new, but you've got to realize the people who are reading, the paper and watching the news today, almost very seldom are people talking about this, and even less seldom are they doing something about it. And very seldom are they defining the real problem. They make it sound like the problem is the climate, or the problem is fossil fuels. Well, no, fossil fuels is a problem, the climate's a problem because of the prosperity, the way that we achieve prosperity. So when we had an economic meltdown a couple of years ago, everybody talked about how do we get growth happening again. And it's very hard to ever hear anybody question growth, you see? So that's the first crisis. The second crisis is that our equity system that's supposed to keep the prosperity and security systems running well is not working so well. And it can't keep up with this growing gap between a rich minority and a poor majority. And the system itself keeps feeding it. And the equity system is not strong enough to handle it. And so it's just out of control. And in fact, rulings like Citizens United and so on, the direction is to keep strengthening the prosperity system to be unaccountable to any kind of equity system. And then, of course, if you have an unstable ecosystem, and if you have insufficient ways to hold powerful corporations and governments accountable, then you're going to have all kinds of security problems. And that really becomes a big deal when you have nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons in play. Suddenly you put these three problems together, and if you really pay attention to these problems, if you aren't freaked out, you aren't thinking about the gravity of the problems, right? And but I said I thought there were four crises, and the fourth one is, why aren't we dealing with the first three? Why are we, in our political realm, in our religious realm, in our economic realm, why are we just grinding away at the machinery without facing the most obvious threats to our well-being and survival? And my explanation for this is that our society runs on a framing story. The framing, and I think there's a number of these framing stories, but our framing story is uncritical of the conditions that run our machinery. And so and we usually get our framing stories from our religions. If we go back over the last 130,000 years or whatever of human evolution, these religious beliefs gave us stories that helped us cope with the real pressing problems that we faced. But now our stories are our religions are providing us with stories that either make the first three problems worse, or just distract people, or just sort of tire people out, and so that they have no energy left to really deal with these issues. Or worst of all, they actually fuel the dysfunctional elements of our system. And if we had time, we could talk about what I think some of those typical framing stories are: stories of domination, revolution, purification, isolation, accumulation, victimization. And these stories just keep our machinery running in very, very dysfunctional ways. Now, for me, as a Christian and as a former pastor and someone very interested in theology, I saw an interesting resonance here. If you know anything about the gospel stories about the life of Jesus, you start to realize that the players in the biblical story are people advocating exactly the same narratives that we see running the world today. And when you have those narratives in the background, and you then take Jesus and the message of Jesus against that historical background, you realize that Jesus was, that at the center of what he was about was this message. He called it the kingdom or commonwealth of God, which was actually a message that was throwing it down to those existing narratives and saying those narratives are suicidal. I'm calling you to repent, which means rethink, which means have a paradigm shift, which means change your consciousness and be willing to live by a different story. And in many ways, his story was a complete reversal of the existing stories on which society ran, and I think continues to run. And if we had more time, we could really explore that in some depth. But where that leaves you then is if you ask the question, what does the message of Jesus, which ought to be important to 33% of the world's population who are Christians and 24% of the world's population who are Muslim, because a lot of Christians don't know that all Muslims love Jesus. And in fact, they have a certain advantage. By believing that Jesus is a prophet, they believe that you're actually supposed to pay attention to what he taught. Christians, by elevating Jesus to this category of savior, can basically ignore everything he said and still sort of get cred for being on his team. But if you take 33% plus 24%, if my calculations are correct, you have over 50% of people who ought to care what he has to say that leads us to an engagement with the planet, into an engagement with poverty, into an engagement of peace, and into a radically different approach to spirituality. When I say radically different, I don't mean radically different just from other religions. I also mean radically different from the status quo in the Christian religion. And when you put that together, I think you end up with something that if Christians could pay attention to it, and even better, Muslims, then we've got over half the world's population who's predisposed to maybe help us deal with the issues that actually face our planetary survival, or that actually threaten our planetary survival. And then the last thing I want to say, and we're going to open up for some discussion, is that when you then plumb the Christian faith, and you realize that the Christian faith has been part of this kind of dualistic mindset that pits soul against body, metaphysics against physics, men against women, race against race, and humanity against the rest of creation. When you see that kind of hostility built into the system, you then legitimately ask yourself, can you find resources for a post-dualistic or non-dualistic way of engaging with the world when what we need now is to see our solidarity with the rest of creation as never before? And I just thought I'd mention three. I want to let you explore any of these if you want to ask about them. But first I want to say something about a doctrine that in the Christian tradition has been highly weaponized and has been used to harm a lot of people, if you know something about our history, which is the doctrine of Trinity. But and in fact, if you know anything about how this doctrine was articulated in the 4th century, it immediately was used as a kind of test to exclude people and harm people. But it's interesting. At the very same time it was being used in that way, there was a group of theologians, they're called the Cappadocian Fathers, and in their articulation of, there weren't any mothers back then in that setting that were listened to at any rate, but they, in their sort of almost playful and meditative engagement with Trinity, and any of you from a Christian background, this is going to make a lot of sense, and if you have no Christian background, I'll get back to something that you will be interested in a minute. But it's actually quite fascinating because what they were saying is they have these three words for three dimensions of God, three realities of God, three persons within God, that God isn't simple unity. God is unity with diversity. And what's really staggering when you think about a dualistic imperial mind in the Roman Empire is they said there is a fatherness and sonness that are not hierarchical. There is a fatherness that elevates sonness to equality with fatherness. There is a sonness that is not in rivalry with fatherness, but is in harmony with fatherness. There is a duality that exists in unity. But not just duality. Then comes this third feature of the spiritness of God. There's a spiritness of God that isn't subsumed into fatherness or sonness. You could use different language. You could say, because in their tradition, Father, Son, Spirit were one way to talk about it. They also talked a lot about God, Word, and Spirit. That there is a speaker and there is a spoken that are one. That what is spoken is one with the speaker. And what is spoken and speaker have a relationship of spirit that is a reality. The relationship is a reality of its own. And so suddenly, and this became highly contested as theologians contest just about everything in the following centuries, they said, is the relationship within God, within this Trinity, is it a hierarchical relationship? The Father is the boss, tells the Son what to do. The Father and Son gang up on the Spirit, tell the Spirit what to do. And you know, the Orthodox Christian understanding of this is no, there is no hierarchy within Trinity. There is sociality. So here you have an image of unity with diversity in harmony that I think is quite exciting for teasing people and inviting people and leading people into a new level of consciousness or a new kind of consciousness. And here's a way to say it. Here's the irony. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the doctrine of the Trinity was used to kill, imprison, and exile people, or make them confess to things that they had no idea what they were talking about, but just get them to say the conforming words so they don't get in trouble, right? It was used in that way. But here's the irony. The practice of Trinity, if you were to practice it rather than enforce it, the practice of it is when you encounter otherness, how can you encounter otherness in harmony and equality, not in subordination, exclusion, or domination? Second thing I would say is this deep, deep theme in Scripture, and especially in the New Testament, but it's in all the Hebrew Scriptures as well, is this theme of reconciliation. Images of a banquet. What is especially a wedding banquet? What is a wedding banquet about? It's about bringing two things together into a new unity, from two families creating one family, from two genders creating a new life, and all of that image of banquet, marriage banquet, feast, bringing people around one table, diversity brought together around one table in unity, even the image of one body, and even the memory of Eden, where everything in Eden is good. You know, this idea of the goodness of all being one. And the interrupter, the danger to Eden being the tree of knowledge of good and evil, where I say, oh, this is good, that's evil. The dualistic mind that categorizes and condemns and accuses, to this dream of returning to something post-dualistic is quite powerful. And then, of course, that primal image in Jesus' teaching of kingdom and commonwealth of God, it seems to me to have something in common with many of the issues that a lot of folks in a gathering like this would be struggling with. Maybe it sounds absurd to say it, but maybe I could say it like this. If you take that image of kingdom of God, in a sense you're saying there's something bigger than God as God has been previously understood. And that is a kingdom that includes God and creation. In other words, a larger reality in which the old primal duality of creator and creation are actually seen as one in one community. Well, when you put that together, I think you can see how it's possible to imagine that at the core of the Christian faith, a different story being told that actually could lead to some pretty exciting and refreshing things. I'll just close with a quote by Ivan Illich, a really interesting Catholic philosopher who was a priest and left the priesthood. And he said, I'm leaving the priesthood, but I'm going to keep my vow of celibacy. I don't get that, but that's what he did. And he said, neither violent revolution nor political reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a powerful new tale. One so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes the preferred story. One so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and our present into a coherent whole. One that even shines some light into the future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. And I think that's one of, to me, the exciting possibilities resident in the Christian faith, and in Islam, and in Hinduism, and so on. And I think it's what a lot of us are all striving toward and looking for. I'll stop there, and we can open up for some questions or comments. Thanks.
I like the metaphor at the beginning with the bridge.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Monolithic structures that are just dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Or misconstrued,
Yeah.
Ideologies that just feed the monster, feed themselves,
Yeah.
go round and round,
Yeah.
But they serve no purpose.
You know, because I travel a lot, I'm often on planes and sit next to somebody, and if I'm friendly or look friendly, and I say hi, very often I'll say, what do you do for a living? And then they'll say, what do you do for a living? And if I mention that I'm involved in the religious industrial complex, almost always what I hear is, I'm really not into organized religion. And I love that discussion, and I usually say, well, is the problem organized, or is the problem religion? Or, and they usually haven't thought about that. And then we often talk about, I try to suggest to them, what if religion wasn't organized to just preserve its own clergy class and keep its own buildings going and keep its own walls up? What if religion was organizing people for the common good to address the issues we really need? And usually people say, oh, that'd be kind of a nice thing. What a concept. So
this is kind of a segue into my question, which is really a critique of me. You're critiquing me. So I made a paradigm shift years ago, right? And I had to synthesize, what am I? I mean, you still declare yourself as a Christian, so I had to ask a question, what am I?
Yeah.
When I made it. So I came up with a description, and I think it's apropos.
Yeah.
What you're saying. So what I call myself a dialectically evolving, mystically nuanced, non-denominational, pragmatic Christian syncretist. So if you were, so really, aren't we talking about some sort of syncretic movement here that would address the amalgamation of Christianity with Islam, with Buddhism, Zen Buddhism,
yeah.
Hinduism, and all the great.
Your first name is?
Paul.
Paul. So Paul, you're asking a question about which I have a lot of interest. So a couple years ago, I wrote a book called Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Mohammed Cross the Road? And everybody asked for the punchline, and I'll give that to you later. But I think that's a really important question. And so the first thing I should say is, I think we've got a lot of legitimate responses to that question. And all of those legitimate responses are also in motion. They're all evolving at every given time. So what I love about what you just said is that it's reflective, and you're trying to be accurate and out, about what that is for you. And I think that's great. So I would say my posture is we need people to do important work in, I would say, at least 3 different areas. The first area is intra-faith. So for the 33% of the world's population that identifies itself Christian and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, we really have to work on the inside to help that community. So that intra-faith work is really important. Then I think there is a kind of interfaith work. Which which says, let's try to occupy a space between religious communities and pull wisdom from those different communities. And we need people doing that.
Would you be creating a new religion?
Well, that's one option, and I'll tell you, that's one I'm terribly uninterested in for a whole bunch of reasons. Partly, I just can't imagine us needing one more. And partly because if I have a choice between joining a new religion that considers itself an improvement on all the others, my smoke alarm goes off. Like, I would much rather join a failed religion that's been humbled by its failures than one that's getting ready to make all of its failures. So but there might be work to do there too, right? But then the third category is what I might call multi-faith. And this are where you have people who are simultaneously cultivating multiple religious identities, and they're trying to work that out because they believe all of these religions have treasures that they have to offer. So here's the thing that I think is lost if we don't keep this one going. This one is the one that says we have to rediscover and refine our treasures in our faith. And we want other people to do the same so that when we come around the table, we really bring something to the table. One last thing I'll say, and then I think we have time for one more question. There's a theologian, he's a Christian theologian down at Claremont Seminary in Claremont, he's retired now, but his name is John Cobb. And John has been one of the Christians, he's in his 90s now, but through his career, he's one of the Christians who has most deeply tried to enter into, especially as someone in a, quote, Western religion, enter into the Vedantic traditions and really understand them. It's sometimes when you're not born in something, it's hard to really get at its depth, but he's really tried to do that. And here's a statement he makes that I think is worth keeping in mind. He says he believes that religions are not saying the same thing about the same thing, and they're not saying different things about the same thing. They're saying different things about different things. They're different research projects. The term he uses for it is that they're incommensurable. And what that means then, I think, is that, and this is especially true when we contrast Eastern and Western in the very broad categories, they're trying to solve different problems. And in that sense, people in each group can say, those guys are trying to solve a legitimate problem, and it's a problem I have too, so I have something to learn from them. And we're trying to solve a legitimate problem, and when we start owning all the problems, I think it's a good thing. We have time for one more question.
So I'm a minister of a community.
Fantastic.
I'm really touched by your 2 lists.
Yeah.
Because I find the tension between my congregants who are grappling with the world stuff,
Yeah.
but don't really want to hear about it at church.
Yeah.
Because there's so many different perspectives,
Yeah.
from traditional to progressive to out fully out of the box.
Yeah.
That I find it really a struggle. And I noticed you left.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about transforming from within, what does that look like?
Yeah. It's really unfair to ask such a fantastic question when I have 0 minutes left to talk. So let me just say something really brief because it's so important. As you may know, this is what I write about all the time. And I think it's a long process. So here's can I just give you advice? Can I just totally give you free advice that's probably worth what you're paying for it? But I would say you have to keep the existing thing going as best as you can. And you have to figure out how to do that in the least number of hours per week so that in your spare time, you can create other spaces for people who are interested in grappling with the new world as they see it. I think that's a charitable thing to do. I think it's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's a possible thing to do. And if we can talk about that later. Thanks, everybody. It's been great being here.